A millionaire CEO once laughed at him in public. Weeks later, that same man came back, desperate, for help with a Ferrari no one else could fix. What happened next shook the entire supercar industry. Don't look away. The story behind this small garage will change the way you see true genius. In the sun-soaked heart of Los Angeles' automotive district, where luxury showrooms gleamed like jewelry boxes and sleek machines sat behind glass like museum pieces, Preston Grant stepped out of his black Bentley with the confidence of a man who thought he'd seen everything. At 48, Preston was the embodiment of modern success, founder of 3 tech companies, investor in 6 more, and the proud owner of a $300,000 Ferrari F8 Tributo that he liked to call art in motion. That morning, however, his prized Ferrari wasn't singing. It was coughing. A subtle, stubborn issue in the engine had persisted despite multiple diagnostics and thousands of dollars in dealership labor. Still, Preston wasn't worried. He trusted prestige, not people. That's why he raised his eyebrows when a man in a worn gray jumpsuit, sleeves rolled to the elbows, approached him at the gas station near Brentwood and said, "Sir, I think your intake resonance is off. Cylinders 3 and 6 are misfiring just slightly." The man, Eli Navarro, looked like someone who spent more time under cars than behind a desk. Preston chuckled, a condescending smirk forming under his designer sunglasses. "And you figured that out by listening? What, you got a PhD in parking lot wizardry?" He looked toward the 2 technicians from Beverly Hills Exotic Motors who had just pulled up in a courtesy car. "You hear that, boys? We've got a miracle mechanic here." The techs laughed, nodding in solidarity with their wealthy client. Eli said nothing more. He simply reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a business card slightly smudged with grease, and placed it gently on the Ferrari's windshield. Then he turned and walked away, the sound of laughter trailing behind him like an insult thrown into the wind. What none of them knew was that the moment they had just dismissed would soon become the turning point in all their lives. Long before Eli Navarro became a quiet figure in the shadows of Beverly Hills garages, he was just a boy growing up among the dry winds and dusty roads of El Paso, Texas. Life there wasn't about status or luxury. It was about surviving another hot summer, about family dinners where tortillas were handmade, and about long days spent around machinery that clanked and coughed. Eli's father, Manuel, ran a small repair shed behind their 2-bedroom house. It wasn't much, just a corrugated tin roof, a battered workbench, and a handful of loyal customers from nearby farms. But for Eli, it was everything. He'd follow his father around like a shadow, too young to lift a wrench, but old enough to watch, to listen, and most importantly, to feel. At the age of 8, while most kids were learning multiplication tables, Eli was listening to a sputtering engine and telling his father, "The timing's off." Manuel froze, brow furrowed, and checked. The boy was right. Again. It happened more than once, and each time the neighborhood began to whisper about the little mechanic with golden ears. Eli's grandfather, Roberto, saw something deeper, something sacred. Once a pit crew mechanic during the early days of desert racing, Roberto had grease in his veins and an understanding of machines that bordered on reverent. He began to teach Eli not just how engines worked, but why they worked. "An engine is like a heart," he'd say, placing Eli's small hand on a tractor's hood. "When it's sick, it tells you. You just have to learn how to listen." While other boys played soccer in the streets or watched cartoons after school, Eli sat beside his grandfather studying combustion charts, thermal flow diagrams, and hand-drawn sketches of crankshafts. His mother, Sophia, often found him asleep at the table, his head resting on a book borrowed from the public library, pages stained with pencil marks and dreams. By 15, Eli could dismantle and reassemble a diesel engine with nothing more than a socket set and instinct. Farmers from surrounding towns began to arrive with aging machinery and quiet hope, asking for the Navarro boy. But as gifted as he was, Eli knew the limits of his small town. The engines were growing older, the work more redundant, and his heart ached for something more. For a challenge that stretched beyond rusted tractors and broken belts. He didn't have a road map, only a fire in his chest and the words of his grandfather echoing in his ears. If you can hear machines speak, boy, you've got a gift. Don't waste it fixing the same engine twice. And so, with nothing but grit, faith, and a backpack of tools, Eli made a decision that would change everything. At 20, Eli Navarro stepped off a long-haul bus into the concrete maze of East Los Angeles, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over unfamiliar streets. In his backpack were a few pairs of work shirts, an old photo of his family, and a grease-stained notebook filled with sketches of engines and formulas he'd memorized by candlelight. He had just over $600 tucked inside his boot, and a dream too big for the broken-down room he rented above a corner store. The cousin he was supposed to stay with had moved out months earlier, so Eli took what he could get: a space with peeling wallpaper, a bed that creaked with every breath, and the sound of sirens for lullabies. He found work wherever he could. Mornings started early at a diner where he washed dishes until his fingers turned raw. Afternoons were spent stocking shelves at a hardware store, and weekends, his most treasured time, were reserved for helping out at a local auto body shop, sweeping floors until someone handed him a wrench. His paychecks were meager, but he stashed away every spare dollar into an old coffee can labeled Navarro Garage, the name he'd scribbled on a paper when he was 16 and too naive to know how long the road ahead would be. By 23, Eli had saved enough to rent a narrow garage space wedged between a recycling depot and a pawn shop. The floor was cracked, the fluorescent lights flickered when it rained, and the only ventilation came from a rusted fan he mounted above the door. But to Eli, it was a cathedral. He arranged his second-hand tools with precision, each wrench and socket in place, not because they were new, but because they were trusted. Word began to spread slowly, first through the local mechanics who couldn't quite diagnose a rattle, then through taxi drivers who found their engines purring again after one visit. His rates were fair, his hands steady, and his ears as sharp as ever. He created diagnostic tools out of discarded radios and salvaged sensors from junkyards, building his own testing rigs from plywood and copper wire. Where other mechanics relied on screens and preloaded software, Eli used a combination of sound, vibration, and a deeply ingrained understanding of mechanical harmony. Over time, Navarro Auto Solutions became more than a garage. It became a haven. Not just for broken-down vehicles, but for people who felt overlooked. And in that small garage, surrounded by old engines and new hope, Eli Navarro quietly laid the foundation for a legacy he hadn't yet imagined. One Tuesday afternoon, as the haze of city smog settled low over East LA, Eli stood outside his garage wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had long since given up being clean. He had just finished tuning a delivery van whose owner had nearly given up on it, and was about to close early when he heard something, a sound that didn't belong. At first it was faint, a low hum beneath the usual roar of city traffic. But as the sleek red Ferrari rounded the corner and pulled into the gas station across the street, Eli's senses sharpened like a violinist tuning a string that was just slightly off. The car was magnificent, a symbol of precision and wealth, but to Eli, it was playing out of key. There was a subtle knocking in the intake, a misalignment so delicate that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Eli heard it like a whisper in a cathedral. Curiosity pulled him across the street, not arrogance, just instinct, the same instinct that had guided him since childhood. The driver was Preston Grant, dressed in tailored slacks and talking into a phone with the kind of intensity that made people give him space. Eli waited patiently until the call ended, then cleared his throat. "Excuse me, sir," he said quietly. "I couldn't help noticing there's a harmonic imbalance in your intake chamber. It's causing incomplete combustion in cylinders 3 and 6. Preston blinked at him, then looked Eli up and down, taking in the faded coveralls, the weathered boots, the oil under the fingernails. "And you figured that out by listening?" he asked, half amused. Didn't know the circus was hiring fortune tellers again? Just then, two dealership mechanics who had come to pick up another car stepped out and joined the moment, their faces twisted with skepticism. "Everything all right here, Mr. Grant?" one asked, eyeing Eli like a stray dog. "Getting a free roadside diagnosis," Preston said with a chuckle, waving toward Eli as if he were part of the scenery. "Apparently our certified team missed something called intake resonance." The taller mechanic snorted. "These street guys think watching a few YouTube videos makes them experts." Eli didn't argue. He simply reached into his pocket, took out his card, slightly creased, smudged with honest labor, and gently placed it beneath the Ferrari's windshield wiper. "If you ever want a second opinion," he said calmly, "my shop's just over there." Then he turned and walked away, the sound of laughter behind him biting more than he let show. But what those men didn't understand, what they couldn't hear, was that machines don't laugh, and truth has a way of humming just beneath the surface, waiting to be recognized. For nearly a month after that encounter, Preston Grant tried to forget about the mechanic with the quiet voice and the confident ears, but the Ferrari wouldn't let him. No matter how many times he brought it back to the dealership, no matter how many diagnostics were run or sensors replaced, the problem returned. Persistent, elusive, like a faint echo in a grand concert hall that no one else seemed able to hear. The dealership eventually threw up their hands and suggested a full engine replacement, $90,000, and a 3-month wait for parts from Italy. Preston's patience, already thin, snapped. He had investors flying in next week, a presentation to make, and the Ferrari, his prized asset, was becoming an embarrassment. One afternoon, while rummaging through the glove box for a pair of sunglasses, his assistant Jennifer found the small business card, slightly curled at the edges. She handed it to him hesitantly. "You kept this," she said. Preston stared at the name. Navarro Auto Solutions. He remembered the laugh, the mockery, but also the unwavering calm in the man's eyes. Pride is a strange thing. It can keep you blind longer than any darkness, but desperation sees clearly. That evening, against his instincts and ego, Preston called the number. When he arrived at Eli's garage the next morning, it felt like stepping into another world, one where time moved slower and attention meant everything. There were no leather chairs, no chrome counters, no complimentary espresso, just the smell of oil, the hum of a ceiling fan, and tools organized like sacred instruments on pegboards. Eli greeted him respectfully, no trace of bitterness, and walked slowly around the Ferrari as if meeting an old friend. He didn't start by plugging in a machine. He listened. He watched. He traced his fingers along the body panels like a doctor examining a patient. "I'll need 2 days," he said simply. Preston scoffed. "They've had it for 3 weeks and couldn't fix it. What makes you think you can solve it in 2 days?" Eli looked him straight in the eye. "Because I've heard this problem before, in tractors, in irrigation pumps, in machines that no one else took the time to understand. The principles don't change." Preston hesitated, then, slowly, handed over the keys. "If anything happens to this car," he warned. Eli nodded. "I know what this machine means to you," he replied softly. "I'll treat it with the respect it deserves." And with that, the door closed behind Preston, and Eli got to work, not with noise or spectacle, but with precision, memory, and the kind of quiet mastery that needs no applause to be real. Inside the quiet walls of his shop, Eli Navarro worked with the kind of focus that silenced the world around him. As the city moved on outside, cars honking, people hurrying, phones buzzing, he moved slowly, deliberately, like a man reading Braille with his fingertips. The Ferrari's engine wasn't just a machine to him, it was a conversation waiting to be understood. He started with the stethoscope his grandfather had given him years ago, cracked at the edges but still reliable, and listened, closing his eyes, fingers resting on the engine block as he tracked the vibrations through steel and heat. What the computers at the dealership had missed, Eli found in patterns, subtle shifts in pitch, vibrations that only occurred when the engine reached a specific temperature, resonances that didn't belong. He drew sound wave diagrams by hand, mapped frequencies against RPM ranges, and pieced together a picture no scanner could print. The problem wasn't electrical. It wasn't digital. It was mechanical, a harmonic interference caused by a slight imbalance in the engine's intake resonance chamber, something the factory's algorithms weren't designed to detect. Eli didn't have proprietary tools or Ferrari blueprints, but he had something better: understanding. Using parts he repurposed from standard equipment, he built custom fittings and made adjustments by hand, tapping bolts like a piano tuner feeling for tone. He slept only 2 hours on a cot in the corner, ate a sandwich standing up, and when the morning of the second day came, he stood before the Ferrari, tightened the last fitting, and turned the key. The engine roared, not loud, not aggressive, but smooth and rich, like a well-composed symphony coming into tune. When Preston returned that afternoon, he walked in with the guarded skepticism of a man expecting either a miracle or a mess. Eli handed him the keys without ceremony. "Take her around the block," he said. Preston slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and paused. Even to his untrained ear, something was different. The sound was fuller, cleaner. He drove down the street, turned once, then again, and came back with wide eyes and a look of reluctant awe. "What did you do?" he asked. Eli explained simply. No jargon, no ego, just the truth. Preston nodded slowly. He didn't understand all the details, but he understood the result. Just as he was signing the invoice, Preston's phone rang sharply. "They're here early," he muttered, checking his watch. "My investors. There's been an accident on Wilshire. I'll never make it downtown in time." Eli didn't hesitate. "There's a canyon road, winding, but clear." Preston frowned. "I just got her fixed. I can't push it." Eli smiled gently. "She's not just fixed. She's better than she's ever been." And with no other choice, Preston got in, started the car, and raced toward the deal of a lifetime, unaware that another kind of meeting was waiting at the end of that road, one that would change not just business, but everything he thought he knew about genius, humility, and where true brilliance comes from. The winding canyon road opened before Preston like a ribbon of possibility, each turn sharper than the last, but the Ferrari gripped the pavement with a precision he'd never felt before. The engine didn't growl, it sang. Each downshift was a whisper, each acceleration a rush of smooth, controlled power. By the time he reached downtown, the tension in his jaw had eased, and in its place was something unexpected: wonder. Outside the glass tower where the investor meeting was being held, a group of sharply dressed executives had just exited a limousine. Among them stood a tall, silver-haired man with piercing eyes who turned sharply at the sound of the Ferrari pulling up. His head tilted slightly. "That's not stock," he murmured. "That harmonic balance. It's extraordinary." Preston stepped out, brushing invisible dust from his jacket. "This is Luca Donati," one of the executives said. "Chief Technical Officer for Ferrari. He's in town for a conference." Luca circled the car slowly, listening, observing, then asked, "Who worked on this engine?" Preston hesitated, then gestured toward Eli, who had arrived quietly and stood back respectfully. "That would be Eli Navarro," Preston said. "He has a small shop in East LA. Solved a problem your certified team couldn't." Luca's eyebrows lifted, and he approached Eli with genuine curiosity. "May I ask what you did?" Eli nodded and calmly explained the resonance issue, outlining his diagnosis and method in clear, precise terms. Luca listened, at first politely, then intently, asking questions that grew more technical. Eli answered each one, even sketching a diagram on the back of a business card to illustrate airflow disruption at peak RPM. After a long pause, Luca turned to Preston. "Your mechanic," he said slowly. has solved something we've been working on for months in Maranello. I need to speak with our head engineer, now. Within the hour, Eli found himself standing in a corporate conference room, whiteboard marker in hand, breaking down his method to a room full of Ferrari engineers on a live video call. When he finished, the screen went quiet. Then the lead engineer spoke, voice tinged with disbelief and respect. Mr. Navarro has identified a flaw in our current resonance dampening system. His approach could improve performance across multiple lines. Luca turned to Eli. Where did you study? I didn't, Eli said quietly. My grandfather was a race mechanic. The rest, I learned the hard way. The room fell silent, not in dismissal, but in awe. Brilliance, it seemed, had found its voice in the most unexpected place, and the world was finally listening.